Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Prof Talks, the podcast brought to you by You Perform and the Prof himself, Professor Greg Whyte OBE. Never forget the OBE.
Never forget that.
My name's Ben. I am joined by the Prof himself. How are you doing, Greg?
Good, very good. Just back from the gym, so actually I feel a bit weaker than I was before I went to the gym, but that's a good thing.
That's exactly the point. Give it a couple of hours, you'll be back on top form. But first of all, we're going to challenge your brain. You challenged your muscles this morning. Now we're going to challenge your brain just a little bit more. And this is a subject that I wouldn't necessarily think is relevant for me, because we're looking at achieving and competing and training as an older athlete. Now, for anyone who can just listen or look at me right now, I wouldn't consider myself an older athlete. So is this really a topic that I should be actually learning from or even just quizzing you on? So first of all, what's important about being an older athlete?
I mean, the answer to that is 100%. You know, the age is for everybody. You know, and I think thinking about age is not just for the aged. You know, to some extent, you're leaving it a bit late if if in your 60s you're starting to think about what you should be doing. That's not to say you shouldn't be doing it. Okay, in the 60s, 100% you should be. But actually, you know, I guess, you know, the analogy here is building a house. If you imagine your life is like building a house, and you know, as we age, we sort of move up in floors, and you know, so you might be on the foundations, you might be on the ground floor, you might be on second floor, you might be in the roof, depending on what age you're at. But everything is underpinned by those foundations. So actually, what you do when you are young is absolutely critical to how you develop and how you age. And so I think it's actually really important. I think often what we do in society, we sort of leave the conversations about aging until people get to that point. And I think it's the wrong time to do it. What we should be doing is thinking about it when we're young, making sure we take the steps to move forward. So if I give you an example of that, you know, a great example is, you know, I've worked for so many years now in areas, we used to call it the female athlete triad. Now we call it RED-S. So energy deficiency syndrome. And what that effectively does is there's a whole host of different issues, but one is for women is that they have a reduction in estrogen, and they can lose their menstrual cycle. So they become from what's called eumenorrhea, so normal menstrual cycle every 28 days, etc. Is it becomes oligomenorrheic, so it becomes a bit more sporadic, and then actually you can become eumenorrheic, where you lose it completely. Now that has a profound effect on bone mineral density. And can lead to what we call osteopenia, so low bone mineral density, and then in later life osteoporosis, which is, you know, much more common post-menopausal, when we know that there is a significant reduction in estrogen due to the menopause. What we know, though, and what's really important here is I think that how you enter, for example, for menopausal women, how you enter menopause is absolutely crucial. And indicative of how you will cope with menopause and what happens post-menopause. So if you come into menopause with pre-existing low bone mineral density and pre-existing low muscle mass, what we know is that you never recapture that post-menopausal, irrespective of what you do. To some extent, it's about maintenance as we age rather than increase. And so I think what's really important for people listening today is actually, if you are young, is that what, you know, the message is, think about it now, so that as you start to age, what you're doing is you've got this fabulous base, this fabulous foundation upon which you can continue to build your house, and that house remains stable and strong as you move into old age.
Exactly. And I think this is a topic that we touched on ever so slightly before, the idea that depending on whether you're a more conditioned or a less conditioned athlete, or a younger or an older athlete, you're going to respond to training in a very different way. And that's obviously unique to everybody. Everybody's different. Everyone's background is different. So that's another thing that I would like to sort of point out. Does then therefore training need to be more specific depending on who you are, where you are at as an age point of view, or even an ability level point of view? Do we have to look at training differently as we get older?
But you know, it's an interesting one. Because it suggests that specificity, you know, it is a suggestion that specificity is more important at a particular time of life. I mean, to some extent, absolutely not. Specificity is always important.
Yeah.
You know, it is training science 101. That specificity, and what we're talking about when we talk about specificity, you know, this was one of those great words that very few of us can say. Certainly difficult to say after a few beers. do we really understand it? Well, we're talking about the specifics of an activity in different areas. So one is around the skill of it. So for example, running versus cycling versus swimming, obviously there is a specific skill difference between those. And so therefore practicing that skill is what then entrains and ingrains that skill. And through that you become more economic, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a skill specificity. There is also a muscle group specificity. And herein lies quite a difficult one, because, and we sort of suffered from this during lockdown, is if people remember, I was doing it too out on my patio with bands, trying to replicate swimming, trying to replicate the stroke. and essentially what you're trying to do with that is you're trying to replicate the muscle group that you'll be using during swimming. So that muscle group specificity, really important. And therein lies a great sort of area of sort of debate, questioning about the cross training effect of running and cycling, and do they improve one another? And then the final thing is around energy system specificity. So that comes down to, if you look in your program, there are those sessions which improve aerobic capacity, those sessions that improve VO2 max, those sessions that improve anaerobic capacity, and so targeting specific energy systems will then lead to very specific adaptations. So specificity is critical, whatever your age. I think the big difference, I think the one, let's sort of remove a dogma and a sort of a belief that we have, and that is that in society we're told that as we age, we can start to take it a bit easier. Just take it a little bit easier because you're getting older. I can tell you it's absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
And the critical thing is that as we age, we have to work harder, and we have to work harder to maintain what we've got. And I think the way to look at that really is look from the age of circa mid-30s, what we start to see is a fall in performance. And that fall in performance is associated with a whole host of things. In men, it's associated with what we call the somatopause. So reduction in growth hormone, reduction in testosterone, leading to a reduction in muscle mass and a whole host of other factors. Aerobic capacity starts to fall, etc. And similarly for women, and actually, collagen is a great example of that. That we know that there is a nutritional reduction of about 1 to 1.5% per year. And for women during menopause, that reduction in collagen content plummets by circa 30% as a result of menopause. So you've got to think that there is this inexorable decline in performance as we age, from the sort of mid-30s as we go through. Now, what we can't do is we can't change biology.
Yeah.
Is that aging process will continue on for a whole host of reasons. But what we can do is, if you think about that as the normal aging process, what we can do through the right training, through targeted, very specific training, is what we can do is we can just reduce the angle of that slope. And so therefore aging still occurs, but it occurs at a slower rate, particularly when it comes to performance. So I think, as we age, the crucial thing to remember is that it is not a given that we get slower and slower and slower and slower by a big degree. There is an age impact on performance, but the harder we train, the less that impact.
So I guess what you're trying to say here is the old adage that I hear a lot is use it or lose it when it comes to speed. Is that sort of true? No matter what age we are, but specifically, when we're a little bit older, sort of speed and strength, if we don't use it, we're inevitably going to lose it.
Well, that use it or lose it is specificity. That's exactly what that is. So, whether we're talking about muscle mass, whether we're talking about power, whether we're talking about VO2 max, whether we're talking about anaerobic threshold, the bottom line is you have to target those specifically. In other words, you have to use those. Otherwise, what you are going to do is you're going to lose those. So you will start to see a decline. And that really, in the training program, what's really important about it is that it targets very specifically each of those determinants of performance. So that what we do is that, yes, as we age, they will drop, but they drop at a much slower rate if we are using them. So we don't lose them at the same rate. That's the key factor.
Yeah. So to kind of bring these sort of principles together, give some people some actionable points. what sort of things are we looking for in terms of how we're managing our training volumes? That could be the amount of time we're training, or indeed the frequency of times we're training, because keeping all that intensity can be quite hard even as a younger athlete. I'm just thinking of all those VO2 max sessions, anaerobic threshold sessions going, if that was all I was doing, I'm going to still find that quite difficult. And I'm in my mid-20s. So is it a case of we have to reduce our overall volume, but keep that intensity and potentially just get rid of the fluff? You know, in cycling and running, they call it junk miles. Do we just need to get rid of those completely and just only focus on those really short pieces of specific exercise and training that are actually going to deliver the adaptations that we need, sort of keep that speed, keep that strength and power as we get older?
It's an interesting one, because in swimming they call it garbage yardage.
Yep, that's the one.
And it is an interesting one. And I think, so I mean, I guess, again, what you have to remember is with aging, there's lots of other things going on as well. So as well as a biologic change, there is also a psychological change that's going on, psychological change that's going on. But critically, I think, and probably one of the most important factors, though, is there is a sociological change going on. Is that when we are young, we are fundamentally carefree because we don't have a mortgage, we don't have bills, we don't have to worry about really anything apart from, you know, schooling and education. And so, and because of that, what we've got is we've got a lot more time. Add on top of that the biology, which means that we recover at a much faster rate. And what we've got as a young, and this brings us back to our, you know, our first question about this foundation level, is that making sure that we make the most of that time is absolutely crucial, so that then the construction of the house above it as we age becomes that much better. But I think it's that area as we age. I think probably one we've spoken about it so many times before, I think, but one of the critical factors about aging, for me personally, and I think certainly everybody that I work with, is that recovery just takes longer.
Yeah.
Now, recovery takes longer, number one. You add on top of that a job, a mortgage, a family, the stresses of life, etc., etc. And all of a sudden, what you then start to see is that time is condensed. You know, the time availability is condensed, and yet at the same time, it takes longer. We need more time to recover. So I think that when I say that as we age, we've got to work harder, I think what's critical in that is that the planning, that's where the real hard work comes, is that what we have to do as we get older is we have to really work much harder on planning. And I think, you know, to some extent, you know, it's always an interesting one to me, and that is that, particularly in sports like triathlon, is that everybody understands that elite athletes have a coach, and that coach has knowledge, expertise, has experience, has wisdom that they can bring to a training program. The paradox is, to some extent, is that it's at a point in an athlete's career where they need less specificity than they do when they get older. And yet, as we get older, as an age group athlete, all of a sudden we think, oh, we do it ourselves. We'll sort it out. You know, no big deal. I don't need a coach. I don't need to spend 50 quid a week on a coach. What I need to do is spend 17 grand on a new bike, because that'll make me go faster. You know, and to me, it always seems paradoxical. And I'm not selling my wares here, by the way, but I think having somebody who really knows what they're doing, working hard for you to make sure that the program is specific as possible as we age, I think it's probably the best investment that you will make, because what it does is it optimizes the time that you've got available, and it will therefore optimize the adaptation and therefore the performance.
Yeah, and this is something that I see every single day, and I'm sure you've got experience yourself doing your sort of long distance ultra endurance challenges. You know, the training volume is going to be massive inevitably, but also your recovery is going to have to be just as specific, just as focused, just as time consuming. And I see it every day. I'm very fortunate to train with our other co-founder, James, regularly in the local area that we're based, you know, through swimming and running. We could do a very similar sort of session. He's a very accomplished athlete, even though he's exactly twice my age. He won't like me saying that, but he is exactly twice my age. But the very next day, I could do the exact same session, if not a harder session, because I've recovered a lot quicker. Because again, I've got youth on my side. Yep. So I think if people are going through that sort of experience, and you know, let's just try and make it relatable for them, allow yourself the time to recover. I think. Well, really
imagine I'm 5 times your age, so imagine how tough it is for me. You know? But it's an interesting point you make, though, Ben. And I think, again, you know, this is where it becomes, you know, and again, this is something that, you know, I always feel like a broken record when I say it, but you know, it's not just the training that you are planning. You know, for example, planning recovery is absolutely crucial, because what you are trying to do, you know, we spoke about this around the delayed onset muscle soreness issue, is that what we're not trying to do is dampen the damage. What we are trying to do is we're trying to accelerate the recovery. And so things like nutrition and rest and sleep quality, all of those things become more and more important as we age, because what's naturally happening is that the recovery process is getting longer and longer. What we're trying to do is we're trying to shorten that. And the only way really of shortening that is making sure that we plan for recovery and making sure that we deliver the best recovery program that we can on a continual basis.
Exactly. And I just want to bring us back to an earlier point where you talked about the idea that when we get older, we want to slow down, we want to do less, we've done our time, we want to relax. But then when I look in the triathlon and the multi-sport world, as we get older, we seem to go longer. We seem to make the events harder for ourselves. Realistically, in my mind, I would think that someone my age may be more capable of doing an ultra endurance event, because quite frankly, we've got the physiological capability to sort of train and recover for it, I think. So why is it then that the older athletes, the older we're getting, the longer we can go, the more sustained our endurance can be? It doesn't quite make sense to me. Have you got an opinion on that one?
Sure. And you know, there's lots of reasons. And interestingly, it's sort of counter to what you've just said. I think the interesting, you know, one of the critical factors that occurs when we age is this process we call sarcopenia. We get a reduction in muscle mass. Okay, now sort of on the outside, you sort of think, well, you know, so for endurance sport, who cares about that? Well, it matters. Muscle matters, because that muscle underpins strength. It then underpins power, and so therefore, as we age, fall in muscle mass means fall in strength, fall in power. Fall in power means fall in speed, and so therefore, as we age, what we effectively do is we get slower.
Yeah,
we get slower and slower. And that to me is why, you know, if you were to ask me what's the one thing we should do as we age, I would say the one thing that we should do as we age is strength work. And that strength work should be hypertrophy based. So you're trying to maintain, remember, it's inexorable, this reduction in muscle mass, but you're trying to maintain that. And the only way to do that is target that with, again, heavy weights, low reps, hypertrophy based approach, where you're trying to maintain muscle mass. We've spoken about this on the last Prof Talks Q&A, where we talk about the bringing of endurance and strength together. We're not going to get massive. We're not going to get massive, but what we can do is maintain that approach. And so I think because of that slowing down, and often, you know, people will come in, for example, into sport. Generally, what we come in at shorter distances. It doesn't matter what sport it is, whether it's swimming, you know, running, triathlon, etc. We come in at short distances. So what we have in our brain preset is a performance that we expect. And the problem is, as we age, we get further away from that expected performance, and that can be really quite negative from a motivational perspective. So the sort of default position from there then is to actually explore something new where you don't have a preset personal best. And so, you know, what's interesting to me, you know, I raced the Norseman, you know, the toughest triathlon on the planet. Well, it's Ironman distance, but you know, what's now started to evolve actually when you take a look at it. So I've done things like the Marathon des Sables. You know, what's the difference between that? Well, it's 156 across the Sahara Desert. It's the environmental challenge, you know. So to some extent, you remove the expectation of running a 3:30 marathon because it's 55 degrees centigrade, and if you can get to the finish, you're laughing, you know. And so I think what the reason why we see this migration of athletes to longer as they get older, I think is biological. I think it's psychological, and now actually because actually it's sort of the done thing. It's what everybody expects. As you get older, you just move distances. Don't worry about staying short anymore. And so now it's sociological as well. So people are sort of being pushed in that direction. So I think that's why we see it. Can you still race as a sprint triathlete or as an Olympic distance triathlete as you age? 100% yes. And I tell you, when you look at the World Championships and you look at the times some of the older age groups are pushing, and it is phenomenal what they can do. Why are they able to do that? Because they've got this wonderful foundation upon which they are building. So they've worked hard when they were young, but more importantly, they're really specific, really targeted training as they age to make sure they can maintain that and keep delivering on that speed and that power as they age.
Yeah, and I think what we've done really well here already is we've outlined what it's like for the more conditioned and more experienced athletes as they're going through that aging process. Yeah, they've got a really good base and they're able to take that into the future, be more specific and still perform and achieve and even improve dramatically as they get older. So what's the difference then for less experienced or complete newbies who are coming to exercise, coming to physical activity for the first time, maybe just in a while, or for the first time ever, and at a time in their life where they would consider themselves to be an older athlete, for example? Is there going to be a difference for them? Do they need to go straight to the long and the slow stuff? Or should we bring them back a bit and go, actually, do the short things, do the fast things, and kind of build that base there, even at an older age?
So it's a great question. it's a great question that I'm not sure there's a really simple answer to. I mean, I've got a client at the moment who I'm looking after, who when he first came, couldn't swim. Had never been on the road bike, but watched my Norseman documentary, black and white, and decided he wanted to do the Norseman.
Wow.
And so,
okay.
that was the first triathlon he wants to do. He wants to do the toughest triathlon on the planet as his first triathlon. Okay.
Fair play to him.
Now I've changed that approach somewhat for very good reason, as you can imagine. But with the end goal still being the Norseman. But I think it's a really interesting one. I think if you are new to the discipline, whatever discipline that is, so it could be open water swimming. A huge number of people now coming to open water swimming, the fastest growing sport in the UK. A huge number of people coming in and being introduced into triathlon, having done a little bit of running in the past, or a little bit of cycling, or maybe a little bit of swimming, much less swimming, when it comes to triathlon. But I think that there's an awful lot of newbies, if you want, so inexperienced coming into the sport, and I think that the one thing about that is that what I would say is that the one thing, there are a couple of things that you want to do. Number one, it's great because you've got no preset concepts of what your performance should look like.
Mm-hmm.
So to some extent, going back to the previous question, we don't worry as much about doing the short stuff and coming 60th and for an Olympic distance going 4.5 hours, because that's what you do, because it's the first time you've done it,
Yeah.
So it's actually a wonderful place to be. I think doing the shorter stuff is really, really valuable, because in order to do the shorter stuff, the type of training that's required is, to some extent, the individual sessions themselves are much shorter. They might be at a higher intensity, but they're much shorter. And so therefore, as a changing in lifestyle, if you're coming into it, coming into sport for the first time, is that it's much easier to fit in with life, those shorter, more regular sessions, as opposed to coming in and thinking, right, I'm going to do an Ironman, or I'm going to do a 10,000 meter open water as a first race, and the volume is enormous, just enormous, and that impacts obviously on the family, on work, and everything else. So there is a real value, sort of from a personal lifestyle perspective, of going short. I think there's a real value also around what is required to go short, as we've just spoken about. Actually, that strength and that power, you can actually start to build this foundation to move on to the longer work as you come in. And so therefore, what it will do is it will target very specifically different determinants of performance, and perhaps those determinants which, if you went long straight away, you wouldn't necessarily work on, because of the volume of training being so high, the duration issue being so high. So I think short is really good. And I think equally, the great thing about short is that you pick up the skills that are required. So yes, in triathlon, it's about transitions, but it's also about things like pace judgment. How quickly do you go out? And to learn that over shorter distances is much more comfortable than it is learning that over an Ironman when you've gone out way too quick for the first 10 miles on the bike and you've still got 102 to go. So and add on top of that, shorter races are cheaper. Shorter races are much more frequent, so you've got a greater opportunity to actually compete and race. They're all over the place now, so you can access them anywhere. At the same time, you become part of the community. It's a great sort of sociological aspect to it as well. So I think, you know, if you are new coming into the sport, to my mind, I would always sort of introduce at the shorter distances, not that that's where you're going to stay, or not that that's where your best performances will be, but I think you get so much richness from doing the shorter distances and then growing from there, rather than going in and you know, it's a classic example of this is the London Marathon.
Yep.
Is that you see 32,000 people at the start line, many of whom the first event they've ever done is the London Marathon. They are at it, you know, and you sort of think, wow, you know, and they've trained really hard, you know, they've done all the training that's required, but running a marathon, doesn't matter how quick you are, is miserable, particularly over the last 6 to 8 miles. All right, it is tough. You've got to really be tough to cope with those last 6 to 8 miles, irrespective of what speed you're going. And I think that if your first exposure to a sporting event, if your first exposure to a sporting event leaves you finishing feeling miserable, or you know, certainly finishing will give you that elation and there's a great achievement, etc. But you know, you spend, you know, 6 miles, you spend an hour in purgatory. It's just not the right experience, I think, first time out. Whereas, you know, if you're a bit pooped on a sprint triathlon, it'll be over in 15 minutes. It's all right, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? So I think generally I would say, if you're coming into it new, go short, gain the experience, become part of the community, and then start to progress as you get more experience.
And I'm assuming then for newer people, these principles can be applied, let's say, outside of a traditional sport environment, but also maybe in the gym or the weight room or a group sort of exercise class, you know, because fundamentally what they're doing there is they're being introduced to exercises and routines that are going to help them maintain or even build strength and power, which is really important as we get older. But crucially, they're picking up technical skills. They're going to be working with the team, potentially working with an instructor who can help them technically build those skills and engage with that social environment. So for a lot of people, we're not only just looking at traditional sports or competitive sports, we're looking at just generally physically active people who perhaps want to do a park run or just want to go to the gym or the weight room or an exercise class a couple of times a week. Do the principles apply exactly the same, or is there any difference?
100%. I mean, what you point towards is coaching.
Yeah.
And it sort of brings us back to the earlier point. You know, if you are in your 50s and you're going skiing for the very first time, would you just think to yourself, would I do that without taking lessons? And let's call it lessons. That's coaching.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think, you know, just notionally, it just makes absolute sense to get expert input, because yes, granted, you can go skiing and you could do it on your own, and by the end of the week you might be able to get down a very short blue run. Okay, if you get expert input, you get coaching, by the end of that week's holiday you may be able to get down a very long hard red run.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's the difference. Is that what it's doing is it accelerates your progression. And actually, in accelerating that progression, what you will see constantly, as you know, we've spoken about before in regard to short-term goals, is that success builds motivation. Is that and critically, to my mind, it builds enjoyment. So the more successful you are, the more enjoyment you will get from it. How can we increase the chances of success? Well, without any shadow of doubt, coaching, mentoring, input from somebody who knows what they're talking about makes a difference. So that includes over global performance, whether it's an open water swim or a triathlon, all the way down to the aspects of training, from strength training to anaerobic capacity training to run skill and technique to bike setup to all those type of things. Expert input vis-a-vis coaching is probably the best investment you will make if you're coming into sport new.
Exactly. And I think there's no better place to finish than that, because what we think we've really sort of achieved there is by saying it's just getting that expert advice. And that's exactly the reason why we're bringing this podcast to people, is that people can get the actionable knowledge and tips and always experience, because yourself and I are both experienced athletes to varying degrees. So if we can help a couple of people just identify where they can improve and where they can enjoy themselves in physical activity or a competitive sport, then I consider that a win. So thank you very much, Greg. I'm certainly looking forward to actually becoming an older athlete. Keeping my after that.
Don't, let me tell you.
Because hopefully I'll be able to enjoy exercise that lasts longer than an hour. Because at the moment, if anything is longer than an hour, I am bored. But that is just my youth. That is just my youth.
They've just got no choice.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in and for listening once again. Do make sure to like, subscribe, leave us any comments or any questions that you would like us to cover, especially some interesting topic points, perhaps talking about sleep or recovery in more detail. Anything else that you would like us to cover with the Prof himself or with any other guests, see if we can bring in some other people. Do let us know, and we will see you next time. So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Cheers.
Thank you very much.